In the first half of the 20th century, many Austrian economists came to the view that there were essentially two approaches to economic development. You could regulate, control, and plan industrial output through the state, or you could allow private actors within the capitalist free market to shape the distribution of resources. The Austrian school of economic thought, represented by figures such as Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, embraced the latter, laissez-faire approach, arguing that individual self-interest undergirds the operations of the economy. In 1920, Mises published a lengthy article titled Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, which defines the statist approach to economic development as socialism. He argues against state control of industry on the basis that it's not possible for a central authority to calculate the efficient allocation of resources. Now, one could think of numerous questions to ask about the implication that market forces efficiently distribute resources. However, what we're going to do today is to investigate the ideas of another man who was very concerned with the issue of economic calculation. In the early 1970s, a British cyberneticist named Stafford Beer consolidated his ideas about operations research, systems theory, and management into the Viable System Model, or VSM. In this cybernetic model, informational flows within a system or organization are modeled on the autopoiesis of a biological organism, and in particular, the adaptable homeostasis of the nervous system. Beer would attempt to apply the VSM to resource allocation in the Chilean economy. But before we come to that, I'll need to go over some basic cybernetic concepts so that this makes more sense. In the 1977 text Designing Freedom, Beer states that any system is defined by one output state, characterized by the total net performance of that system. In Beer's view, systems are inherently dynamic and adaptable. He disputes that an institution is a fixed entity with activity divided into particular areas, and presents the view that an organization has various potential configurations. The quantity of possible behavioral configurations in a system constitutes that system's variety, or complexity. Beer specifies that individuals and hierarchies within organizations determine their variety. If there are n people in a system, and each of them has a variety, and each can adopt a number of possible states, then the variety of the total system, thus defined, will be x to the power of n. So if there are only 40 people, n equals 40, each of whom has only two possible states, and there are still 2 to the power of 40 possible states of the system. In cybernetics, variety is self-regulating. Ashby's law states that you can only properly absorb a given quantity of variety with an equivalent quantity of variety. Beer views computing and teleprocessing as useful tools for variety amplification, which is an important way of channeling the variety within a system to maintain a homeostatic or stable equilibrium. In Designing Freedom, he gives an example of what this means for a company. Variety is cropping up faster in this system than the system can absorb it, and this is bad from the customer's point of view. If it happens all the time, it'll be bad from the store's point of view as well. The customer will desert the store looking for somewhere with a shorter relaxation time. So, the temporary instability of service in the store will become permanent, and at that very moment, incipiently catastrophic. Earlier, I spoke of informational flows. Information and difference are fundamental elements of cybernetic ontology, and essential to grounding our understanding of variety. To the cyberneticist Gregory Bateson, there is an infinite number of differences between an object and its environment. A fact is one difference, or one flow of information extracted from the object to make it intelligible in communication. In the 1970 lecture Form, Substance and Difference, Bateson argues that, in fact, what we mean by information, the elementary unit of information, is a difference which makes a difference, and it's able to make a difference because the neural pathways along which it travels and is continually transformed are themselves provided with energy. The pathways are ready to be triggered. Where Beer describes variety growing within a system, Bateson states that the system operates to create differences, and this is essentially the same point. The system requires informational flows to stabilize itself, and these flows generate difference, variety, possibilities. Beer proposes using computers and telex machines to streamline the flow of information within a system, generating instantaneous feedback loops. With this proposal, he comes directly to the issue of economic planning and resource allocation. Designing Freedom addresses the question of a planned economy in the following way. Then, for example, there will have to be a model of industries by industry, and the models of those industries by product, by investment, by labour force, and so on. This is fine until we realise that these models treat the components as if they were entities, characterised by product, by investment, by labour force, and so on. But of course they are nothing of the kind. They are all these component industries and their component firms, dynamic, viable systems, and the items we were listing are continuously variable inputs and outputs. In essence, Beer is arguing in favour of planning industrial output. Designing Freedom reads as an attempt to resolve the economic calculation problem through computing. However, it's not at all content with the operations of government institutions. In Beer's view, organizational hierarchies are simply fault-finding charts, sustained by psychological conflict in human relationships. Computers are wasted on mere incantations to process data, as if processed data were necessarily digestible and nutritious for the institution. Departments set up in response to national variety generators are stagnant and incapable of handling the dynamic variety of systems. But what if the existing bureaucracies of systems could be replaced by new scientific tools and new democratic machinery across the entire economy? What if the economic structures could attenuate the high variety stimuli they receive through a regulatory model that absorbs useful information and discards the excesses to maintain their viability? What if, at the same time, there was an algorithm which instantaneously calculated the requisite variety of an organization without limiting the content of information which could be absorbed by that organization? Beer suggests that all of this is possible. To quote Designing Freedom again, "You probably know that it is possible by electronic simulation to make a 10-year projection instantaneously, and then to change your policy and see what difference it makes. This is to take an experimental approach to policy making, doing the experiments in the laboratory of the control room. So instead of experimenting on the poor old nation and discovering 10 years later that your policy was wrong, you can test and discard a dozen wrong policies by lunchtime without hurting anyone. After lunch, maybe you will find a good policy."
How do you control an economy? As we sit in England, we may feel, well, the answer to that is you don't. Probably you remember that when Mr. Macmillan was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he made a very famous remark. He made several, but the one that I have in mind, he said, running the economy is like trying to catch a train on last year's timetable. And indeed it was. His data were about a year out of date.
Of course, none of this is theoretical. As alluded to earlier, these ideas were tested out in Chile through a project called Cybernetic Synergy, or CyberSyn. In November of 1970, America's first democratic socialist government was elected in Chile. El Gobierno de Unidad Popular, led by Salvador Allende, presided over a radical overhaul of Chile's entire economy, including land reform measures and nationalization of industry. Fernando Flores, the new general technical manager of the Cooperación de Fomento de la Producción, or CORFO, invited Beer to develop a potential cybernetic reorganization of Chile's public sector in 1971.
Now, the story that I want to tell you began in 1971, in the middle of the year. I had been going around using this model that I have explained to you in big companies, in agencies, in all sorts of places. And then I suddenly got a letter which very much changed my life. It was from the technical general manager of the State Planning Board of Chile. Remember, 1971, President Allende was in office. He remarked in this letter that he had studied all my works, he had collected a team of scientists together, and would I please come and take it over? I could hardly believe it, as you can imagine.
Beer of course obliged and was soon entirely committed to implementing a rudimentary viable system model of regulation to the Chilean economy by March of 1972. CyberSyn was intended as a decentralized computer system of coordination, which would incorporate feedback from the lower and upper rungs of a management structure reciprocally until an equilibrium of consensus was reached. It would thus form a perfectly democratic decision-making process, consistent with the socialist aim of worker emancipation. As this diagram indicates, CyberSyn was ultimately a recursive feedback system to be applied at every level of society from worker to company. Beer describes this as a dynamic system of simple models of dynamic systems, wherein different levels of recursion reduplicate a cybernetic system of regulation over and over with relevant adjustments for individual levels.
When we make a viable system model of a sector, a whole industry, we find that the elements are enterprises or firms. If we make a model of any one firm, by recursion, we then find that the elements of the viable system are plants. And this is how we worked through the economy, modeling everything by recursion, always against the same model which we studied last time.
The project never actually moved beyond a limited scale in terms of nationalized enterprises, with only certain companies participating, so we will instead briefly look at its application in the industrial sector. The prototype of CyberSyn was developed in accordance with the Production Development Corporation's management structure, with Beer outlining a hierarchy of 5 levels, or systems. The higher levels, the first, second, and third of the structure, governed daily operations, where the fourth and fifth worked on a more abstracted and developmental basis. The first system was the level of individual plants within an enterprise, which Medina calls essentially autonomous, save for homeostatic operational limits imposed to maintain the broader enterprise's stability. The second and third systems resolved production issues where necessary and transmitted production indices of material inputs and outputs throughout the system. The most serious issues were filtered to the fourth level, which this operations room prototype was created to visually represent. Medina describes it as a vital link between volitional and automatic control, or in the case of industrial management, between centralized or decentralized regulation, as well as a space for decision-making.
System 4, dealing with the future and the outside. And then the task of top management, right up there, System 5, perceived as mainly being about monitoring the homeostat that connects 3 and 4.
Chile had limited technological resources, mostly controlled by one national enterprise, and the government could apparently only allocate one mainframe computer to Project CyberSyn. Beer's Cybernet program successfully expanded a network of telex machines throughout Chile's nationalized firms in early 1972, but it was reliant on specific terminals and often could not work fast enough to yield adequate results. While computer feedback was intended to be instantaneous, firms could transmit data once per day, and there were instances of companies waiting days or even weeks for directives. However, CyberSyn evolved fast throughout Allende's term, with the cyberstride phase of the project implemented by November. Computer software conducted statistical filtration and modeling on information collected from firms, alerting firms or upper management of irregularities and fluctuations. In 1973, all 5 levels of CyberSyn were established and assisting in the coordination of industrial activity. Beer and Flores were attempting to expand the CyberSyn framework throughout the Chilean economy, though the majority of industry remained unaffected by the project. Although the Unidad Popular government engaged in Keynesian policies which increased wages and employment to counteract the economic downturn they inherited, Chile's economic situation rapidly deteriorated from 1971. In no small part due to persistent CIA operations funding strikes and anti-government actors. I will go into much more detail about American clandestine operations in Chile in my next video, but in short, a CIA-backed military coup led Salvador Allende to commit suicide in the presidential palace on the 11th of September 1973. Augusto Pinochet became the de jure president the same day, ending Project CyberSyn along with several decades of democratic governance in Chile. Medina views Project CyberSyn as attempting to model a deeply unstable economic system using only a subset of the variables required to understand the system, given that it operated amidst a backdrop of inflation, shortages, black markets, labor strikes, social unrest, and political violence. She describes Beer's efforts to augment worker participation as being constrained by technological limitations, institutional resistance, and widespread ignorance, with the majority of workers unaware of the CyberSyn system and its management tools. In Designing Freedom, Regulating a Nation, she writes that, Although CyberSyn engineers received explicit instructions to work in conjunction with worker committees in developing quantifiable models detailing factory production capabilities, often the converse occurred, and the engineer would treat the worker with an air of condescension rather than cooperation, or he would ignore the worker altogether and deal directly with management. Moreover, they frequently hid or overlooked the political facets of the project in favour of emphasising its technological merits, thereby avoiding potential labour conflicts. In practice, CyberSyn was demonstrably not a decentralised, hyper-democratic regulatory network of computers, and it rather reinforced the structure of an emerging planned economy. Yet, Beer viewed the project as a qualified success. He describes its management operations in this excerpt from Designing Freedom. They could sit with their ministers in the Economic Operations Room in Santiago, watching the animated screens and discussing the alerting signals provided daily by that clever computer program. They had buttons in the arms of their chairs so they could command the appearance on other screens of supporting data, to the capacity of 1,200 different color presentations, focused through 16 back projectors. They could also control preliminary experiments in simulation on a huge animated model of the dynamic system.
Let us suppose that these elements of the state are the big departments of state, like the foreign affairs and the economy and home affairs, so on. And then we'll have those, and the following things will happen, and then we must have a system 2, and I built it up on a piece of paper lying on the table between us. Then a system 3 and a system 4, and I got that far. And then I got to system 5, and I drew a big histrionic breath. And I said, I was going to say, this compañero presidente is you. Before I could say it, he suddenly smiled very broadly, and he said, System 5, at last, the people. That was a pretty powerful thing to happen. It had a very big influence on me.
So at the end here, I would just like to thank all of you for waiting so long for a new video. It has been incredible to see so many new subscribers here, even though I haven't uploaded for a year and a half. Trust me, I do have a lot of content that I still want to upload, and I will be back definitely this year with at least one more video, hopefully 2, and I want to get into a regular pattern of uploading once or twice a month, I would say. So thank you.